Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for coming out and joining me tonight. I just want to say thank you for hopefully having an opportunity to sort of walk through the financial aid process. I know it's not the most fun topic. It can get dry at times. I'll try to make it maybe a hair less dry, if that's okay. And then hopefully you'll have a good crash course here tonight. That's ultimately what we want to do, is sort of just expose you to the overall process. We'll talk about what schools do from a financial aid office and how we package financial aid. Most of it will be at a high level. Almost nothing we're going to talk about tonight is specific to Illinois Wesleyan. So you can take this no matter where your students are interested in attending college. This is applicable pretty much anywhere you go. I might use Wesleyan as an example here and there, but largely it's going to be kind of neutral information for tonight, okay? We are going to have a Q&A at the end as well. So if you experience a question midway through, go ahead and jot it down. If it's a very specific or personal question, I will be up here available afterwards as well, where we can kind of talk through some of that specifics. If I can't answer it, I'll sort of give you next steps of what you may want to think about, or maybe conversations for people you can have those discussions with. But hopefully this is informative, and we're just going to jump right in. So overall, the philosophy of what financial aid is and how financial aid is awarded and given out are really, we're going to talk a lot about what the federal process is going to be like. Okay, the federal government is going to really highly regulate the financial aid process. So there's only certain things that we can do and only certain types of financial aid that students can qualify for. So ultimately what that philosophy is we're trying to determine a family's ability to pay. We know oftentimes there can be a disparity between willingness to pay and ability to pay, and there are infinite number of family situations. Everyone's going to be a little different, their income's going to be a little different, their assets are going to be a little different. So how do you sort of make a standardized process that's as fair as possible, encompassing all of those possible different types of family situations and units? That's really where we're kind of the crux of the FAFSA application that we're going to talk about tonight. That's the federal form we'll get into a little bit. But that's what we are in the financial aid office are sort of tasked with doing, is saying, how do we fairly and consistently apply rules to all of the myriad and variety of different situations and income scenarios we find ourselves in? What we're tasked with doing is finding what the demonstrated financial need of that family unit is, okay? And need can be sort of a nebulous term a little bit, but hopefully we'll eliminate that a little bit tonight as well. So there's really sort of two main sectors of financial aid. There's going to be merit-based aid, which is financial aid that you can think of as either based off of earning something through attributes or skill or talent. And then there's need-based financial aid, which is going to be based off of a financial picture. Okay, so those are the two main types of financial aid. Again, merit's what you can typically think of as scholarship. My student got a certain GPA, or maybe like SAT or AC test score, and so that scholarship is earned based upon those criteria. Or maybe it's a music scholarship because they're talented in an instrument, or maybe it's an art scholarship, something that's based off of their merits and their talents. Whereas grants are going to be sort of the need-based components. The grants are going to be based off of the FAFSA application, and those can be reevaluated every year as income can change from year to year. And we'll get into more of that in the presentation tonight, but just know that in terms of financial aid, those are sort of how that's broken down. Aid that's based off of merits and attributes, and aid that's based off of finances. So we're going to get right into the FAFSA application. The FAFSA stands for Free Application for Federal Student Aid. That's the official name. That's why it's called FAFSA. It's not just an odd name. It actually has an acronym. You'll find out in the financial aid world we have an acronym for just about everything. So hopefully as we walk through that presentation tonight, you'll get sort of a better understanding of all those acronyms and what that applies to and means to you as a family. So the first thing we're talking about is the FAFSA application. One of the first things you'll want to do is set up an FSA ID for the student and one for a contributor. And I say contributor, which is really a parent. It's just anyone who's contributing information to the FAFSA completion process is a contributor. So it could be a parent, step-parent, or some other individual who's contributing, okay? Ultimately, the student needs an FSA ID and that contributor needs an FSA ID. If you already have an FSA ID because you already have a student in college, you don't need to do anything else. It's going to be the same FSA ID. But if you don't, you'll need to register for one. Okay? It's basically like a username and a password that gives you the ability to log into the federal system and apply a signature at the end of the application. It is very particular. So when the student registers for their FSA ID and the parent registers for their FSA ID, you can't use the same email address. It's very sensitive. They're very particular about sharing information between students and parents. Ultimately, once the student turns 18, they're no longer a minor, and therefore privacy laws kick in. And therefore, parents should not share their FSA ID information with the student, and student, you should not share yours with the parent. We know behind closed doors, it's often the parent who's completing the FAFSA. Very common. I just don't need to hear about it, okay? Because there are different things that the Department of Education tells me that says, oh, you need to now ask questions, and I don't want to have to ask those questions as a financial aid administrator. So just know they're separate, okay? And email is one of those unique things that has to be a separate email account. So if your student doesn't have a private email account, here's a great opportunity to sort of start that ball rolling, okay? We do not recommend that students use their school email account because eventually their school email will be deactivated, and if they ever need to recover their FSA ID information, it's going to be a lot more difficult if they don't have access to that email account, okay? So this is why we sort of recommend going to private, whether it's through Gmail or through Yahoo or some other email vendor. Make sure you get that set up ahead of time. There is a mobile app as well, so if you want to complete the FAFSA through the mobile app or tablet, you can do that. Most people find it a little easier to do it either on a desktop or a laptop computer, but just know that there are some flexibilities if you need to be on the go for that. One of the new things that started last year is called the DDX, which is the Direct Data Exchange. So what this process is it's a way that the IRS will automatically import your tax information directly onto the FAFSA, okay? Now, it doesn't necessarily work for all family situations, but regardless of your situation, you must give consent for that process to happen in order for that FAFSA application to be considered a valid application. So if you do not provide consent, then the financial aid office at the schools cannot do anything with that application. Okay, it'll come over as a rejected FAFSA, and it basically just sits there and goes nowhere. So they are sort of bottlenecking you a little bit into this particular process. However, it's significantly easier, okay? So you don't have to worry about what income line goes in what question on the FAFSA, and did I answer it right? Almost all of the data that they need for income is gonna naturally pull over as part of that DDX, okay? The other thing to keep in mind is the government selects about 12% of applications for an audit, and that audit is called verification. If you use the DDX to import your tax information, it fulfills any income requirements that verification would require. So for instance, if your FAFSA was selected for verification, we would then have to reach out and say, hey, we need your tax returns. It needs to be signed, it has to be this way, it has to be this particular tax year, and this is the kind of information we're looking for. Well, if you do use the DDX, then it automatically fulfills the income requirements for verification, and schools no longer have to collect that piece, and it's a little bit less of a headache from a verification perspective. So pretty important tool to use. Now, one thing to know is that when it pulls over the tax information, you won't get to see what gets pulled over, okay? It will be grayed out. All the numbers will be replaced with dots, and it will be grayed out so you can't modify it or see it in any way. They do that for identity protection purposes because hackers and online people are a little sneaky these days, and they can still gather your information from websites like the FAFSA or other things if you're on like Google, for instance. So as an identity and as a security measure, you won't get to see what kind of information pulls over. We will once we get a copy of the FAFSA, but you won't. So just don't be alarmed if you can't see the income information. The other thing to sort of be aware of is that the FAFSA is going to use what they call is prior year, or PPY. What that means is they use tax year information from 2 years ago as a basis for their formula. Okay, so the FAFSA that's getting ready to open up this October 1st is going to be for the 2026-2027 academic year, which is next fall, and it's going to use 2024 income information, okay? And they do that so that everyone has a chance to use the DDX process. Some people file extensions for tax filing purposes because they own a farm or a business, and it can delay the financial aid process. So the Department of Education says, all right, we're going to use 2 years back so that everyone should have filed their tax return by now, and there should be no possibility of delaying the financial aid process for students, okay? We know that situations can change from a 2-year period. So we know your 2025 income or 2026 income may be different than what was on your 2024. And we can take that into account as well. We'll get into that a little bit through either professional judgments or appeals, where we can account for fluctuations in income. Here are some questions I want to highlight for you as you're completing the FAFSA. I just want to draw your attention to them because we see that these are sort of the most problematic areas that we find when looking at applications. The first one that's on there is going to be the student social security number. The student social security number is the one piece of information that's the most vital piece on the FAFSA. It's the most pain in the neck one to correct if you get it wrong. So if I can really emphasize that one to say, make sure you get that one right out of the gate. Make sure students or parents, you have that social security card sitting next to you and you double, triple, quadruple check that that number is accurate. You can correct it if it's wrong later on. It's just a real hassle, a real pain in the neck. Most of the time we end up encouraging students to file a brand new FAFSA because it really is that big of a deal, okay? That's the one piece of information that sort of ties everything together from a financial aid history. So anytime a grant is processed or maybe a federal student loan is processed, it all comes back to that student social security number, okay? So that's why it's that important. Also, when you register for your FSA ID, it's going to ask for social security number. And if your social security number doesn't match your FSA ID, you can't even submit the FAFSA because it'll say that there's a mismatch in the information, okay? So pretty important. There are also about 14 different questions that deal with dependency status. So for instance, for financial aid purposes, your student will be considered dependent and therefore require parent information if they can't answer yes to at least one of those questions. So even though your student may be living on their own, paying for their own rent, paying for their own college education, for financial aid purposes, they'll still be dependent and require parent information unless one of those dependency questions are indicated as yes. Those types of questions would be things like, is your student in a master's or doctoral level program? Are they an orphan or a ward of the state? Are they 24 or older? Are they a veteran of the armed forces? These types of situations, about 14 different situations that if they can't answer yes to one of those, then it will require parent information. They will be dependent for financial aid purposes, okay? The other thing is the signatures. For some reason or another, you can still submit a FAFSA without signing the form. If you don't sign it, they'll reject the application. So I don't know why that's not a requirement these days, but just know it's one of the last things that you do is apply a signature, okay? So just make sure you gotta type in your FSA ID and password, and then you click sign. There's a little blue box, and then once those boxes are signed, it will say your signature has been applied, then submit the FAFSA, okay? So just know that it is easy to skip, depending on the type of browser you're using. Sometimes that blue box doesn't show as a blue box. Sometimes it's like a grayed out or whited out box, but it's supposed to be blue. So sometimes it really is easy to skip, but just know that if you skip the signatures, then you go back and look for it before you actually click submit. There are a number of questions that deal with untaxed income. Most of those will probably be zero for you, and that's okay, okay? But there may be the occasional thing that does apply to you, and you have to indicate that. What I would say is I think there's probably 10 untaxed income questions. And every question has a little circle with a question mark next to it. If you click on that, it's sort of like a tips and tricks of what they're really trying to ask for. So if you're not really sure what they're asking about, click on that small little icon, and it will tell you more specific information about what's being asked for those items. Again, most of the untaxed income won't apply and will be zero, so that should be normal. But on the off chance if something does apply to you, again, just make sure you're looking at that hint button with the question mark in it. So here's some changes that have been occurred the last couple of years. There's been a lot of turmoil in the FAFSA process because the government 2 years ago decided to completely redo and revamp the entire formula and application process. So here's some things that do sort of change from year to year as they're trying to tweak and sort of fine tune the formula, if you will. So if you do any research, you'll notice the FAFSA results used to be called an EFC, or an expected family contribution, and now that's referred to as an SAI, which is the Student Aid Index. Okay, so that's a big sort of moniker change in terms of the name. Some of the more specific things that are really important to a lot of families is the number in college is no longer considered as part of the formula. They do ask that as a question on the FAFSA, so you can put in the number in college, but it no longer impacts the FAFSA results. Okay, so if you have more than 2 in college, or more than 1 in college, there won't be any benefit to you in the formula like there used to be, so just be aware of that. From an asset perspective, there's always making some changes for assets. Previously, if there was a child support situation where a parent was receiving child support, it used to be considered untaxed income. Now it's considered an asset, which is actually better because assets are considered at a lower percentage rate than income is. So that, just know that there's a slight difference on things like that. And then for individuals who have a small business or own a farm, previously up until this current year, those individuals were required to report the full net value of that small business or farm. Starting with this year, that's been excluded. So you no longer have to report the value of a small business or a farm if you employ less than 100 employees. Okay, so that's also good news for anyone who owns a small business or a farm. Okay, so there are some nuances that can change from year to year. This goes to, we talked about grants and how grants are reevaluated every year because they're based off of finances. These are sort of the things that can impact a student's eligibility for grants because the formula changes or the income that goes into that formula could change. Okay, and then we'd always talk about how, you know, if there's a divorce situation, that a student can technically choose which parent to report on the FAFSA. The federal rule that it's kind of difficult to find, but that's really kind of written into law, is that if there is a divorce situation, the parent who should be on the FAFSA is the one who provides the most financial support to that student in the last 12 months, okay? Sometimes that's hard to know if it's like, you know, ultimately the family, they can say, well, it's really split 50-50. And I would ask questions like, okay, well then who pays for a cell phone? Who pays for medical insurance, car insurance, transportation expenses? You know, and then usually it's not really 50-50. Usually someone comes out ahead financially in terms of the financial support. So just know that whoever that parent is that's going to provide the most support is one who gets reported on the FAFSA. If for some reason that just can't be determined, then yes, the student does get to choose which parent to report. So this is kind of what happens behind the scenes. Once you've got all the information in and you click submit and they run that data through their formula, there are 2 calculations, one for parents and one for students. They're not using the same percentage rates for students as they are for parents, which is why there are 2 separate calculations. But the net result is that SAI number, that Student Aid Index. Okay, that's going to be one of the 2 main components of how schools determine financial aid eligibility. Now, from an eligibility perspective, going to that formula, they look at a myriad of things. So they look at, obviously, income for the student and parents. They look at asset information, but they also look at things like how old the parents are. The closer the parents are to retirement age, the more their income and their assets are not counted in the formula because they protect those assets and income because they know that those individuals are going to be retiring soon and need that to live off of. So it's not a simple formula of, I make X dollars, so my SAI is Y. I get a lot of questions about, hey, Andrew, can you help me better understand this? This is my income, this is how many people are in my household, what's my SAI going to be? And I always tell them, I'm sorry, I can't tell you because it's a really in-depth, really complicated formula. Okay? But just know that everything you put on the FAFSA typically has some level of impact other than, say, like number in college. Now, I mentioned before that the FAFSA is always going to use income information from 2 years ago as a basis, okay? But schools can use current day income as a basis for the FAFSA results if there have been changes to your income level. So for instance, we know that if there's a turbulent economy, which that seems to be the case, there's a lot of loss of employment or change of employment or reduction in income or whatever that may be. Schools can take into account those types of changes as part of the FAFSA process. You'll still be required to go through the normal FAFSA process by doing all the stuff we just talked about. But if your 2024 tax year information is a lot higher than what you're experiencing current day, then reach out to the college that your student's interested in attending, and they'll probably talk about either a professional judgment or an appeal. It's the same thing, just two different types of terminology. Okay? Ultimately, what they can do is gather up some information about your current day income situation and then use that as a basis for the FAFSA results, as opposed to the standard process, which is the 2024. Okay? There are a couple different situations where schools can take into account. So if things like loss of employment, if someone has a extraordinary high medical expenses, or maybe there's elderly care expenses, or there are a variety of different situations where a financial aid office can make adjustments to the income level. So my encouragement to you would be, if that fits your situation, then don't be shy about reaching out and ask questions about what their process looks like to account for those financial impacts that you might have. Okay? So we know that there are things that we can do to help accommodate changes, and the government allows us to. We put a special flag on the FAFSA that says, hey, we're doing an appeal, we're choosing to modify the income information, and when we put that flag on there, the Department of Education says, okay, that's not a fraud case, we're not artificially lowering the numbers for gaming the system. So now we're going to start getting into sort of the college view. We've talked a lot about the federal process with the federal application. We signed up for the FSA ID, we got that all good to go. We got into the application, we used the DDX to import our tax information, we input our asset stuff, we applied our signatures at the end of the FAFSA, and we hit submit. Okay? At the end of the application, they should tell you what the SAI is, so you'll get that. Every school that's listed on the FAFSA will get the same information. Okay? And students can list up to 20 schools on the FAFSA. What schools do is we're going to pick up here is we say, okay, how does a school determine financial aid eligibility? Okay, the first thing we do is we look at the cost of attendance. Now, the cost of attendance is not what it costs to attend. I know it's very clear by that terminology, but it's not. Okay, what the cost of attendance from a school perspective is those costs that a student will incur while attending. Okay, that seems like a jumbled mess, right? So it's things like, it's not just tuition and activity fees, or it's not just room or meal plan. It's also things like books and supplies, transportation expenses, incidentals. We know that students are going to need shampoo and soap and toothpaste. So it's a variety of different costs that a student will incur while attending college that we make some assumptions for. Okay, so it is going to be a slightly inflated number than what the actual charges will be on a billing statement that you see. Okay, so what we do is we take that cost of attendance, we have the SAI that we get from FAFSA, and then that's what determines a student's financial need. Okay, one thing to note there is the cost of the college is going to be part of the student's eligibility for aid. Okay, so a school may cost more, but students may qualify for more just because of that equation. Okay, and we'll walk through that a little bit later in the presentation as well about how does that make sense. But just know that this financial need is sort of what the financial aid office is after. Okay, we need to determine what is that student's financial need, and then how do we best meet that financial need. It's a great way to ask. I'm glad you asked that. This is how we do it. Okay, what we do is we look at what kind of grant systems are available, what kind of loan systems are available, and what kind of student employment systems are available. Okay, obviously, the grant section, that's the free money, that's what we want to see the most of. Okay, we are going to talk about some loan information tonight. I do think it is helpful for you to be educated about federal student loans and what that means. I think there is a lot of misinformation out there about federal student loans. We are, as a school, we are required to offer loans to students if they file a FAFSA. The student is not required to take them, but we are required to federally offer them. And we'll get into a little bit more of that later. But student employment also counts as need-based financial aid. Okay, so being able to work on campus is often impacted by that financial need number that we're talking about. And that's, again, this is something that typically the financial aid office, when they put together a financial aid package and you get it in the mail and it lists out all the things that your students qualify for, this is essentially the process that every financial aid officer goes through when determining eligibility for financial aid. So let's just get right into the grants. Okay, the three main types of grants are going to be either the federal, the state, or from the institution, the school itself. Okay, from a federal perspective, the Pell Grant is going to be sort of the flagship one that you hear most about. It's strictly tied to what the SAI is. So depending on the SAI results from the FAFSA application, your student either will qualify or will not qualify, depending on what the SAI is. The lower the SAI, the higher the Pell Grant. The higher the SAI, the lower the Pell Grant. Typically, Pell Grant cutoff is somewhere about 7,000 SAI, somewhere close to that. So if your SAI is above 7,000, it's still technically possible to qualify for Pell, but most people don't, okay? But that's usually, like, the formula is a little more complicated now than it used to be, so I can't tell you exactly what that SAI requirement is for Pell. Generally, it's around 7,000, okay? Like I said, there are situations where a student can have a higher than 7,000 SAI and still qualify for Pell, but it's only very specific cases where that happens. The state grants, just kidding. The state grants, the main one for the state of Illinois is the MAP grant, the state of Illinois MAP grant. The maximum award for that is $8,064, I think is what it is. That one is impacted because you have to file by a certain time frame that the state establishes. The SAI has to be below 9,000, and the cost of the school actually does impact the amount that your student will qualify for in the MAP grant, okay? So there are a lot of different nuances specifically with the MAP grant. As terms of the filing date requirement that the state has with the FAFSA, that one's a bit tricky, and I want to bring it to your attention because we, at the school level, will never know the filing date requirement for FAFSA until 2 days before the state sets it, okay? The way that works is they look at how much funding has been approved and how many people have applied with the FAFSA so far. And they look at, okay, based upon those metrics, how close are we to meeting that budget? And then as soon as they determine that we're too close, they'll set the date. So I always tell families, get it in as soon as possible, because I never know what that date is until 2 days beforehand, and I can't call everybody. Emails tend to be less effective. We run into some problems with texting as a school with federal laws, so just get the FAFSA in as soon as you can and then not worry about that filing date requirement. Just so you know, last year's filing date was in August, this year's filing date is in June. Okay, so the date can swing pretty wildly in terms of when the state sets their date for the MAP grant. This is MAP grant specifically, okay? It's the one that a lot of Illinois students will qualify for. Not everybody, but a lot will qualify for. So if you don't meet the filing deadline, that's one of those hard requirements, but your SAI has to be below 9,000 as well. That's kind of the other bigger component. So my recommendation, as soon as October 1 rolls around, start chipping away at that FAFSA and get it in as soon as you can. Now, there are also institutional or grant funds from the schools themselves, okay? Oftentimes I talk to people who don't think that they'll qualify for federal and state aid, and I will tell them every time, still file the FAFSA application. Because oftentimes there's something you get from the school, whether it's here's $1,000 just for filing the FAFSA grant, that's pretty common. Or maybe there are other need-sensitive awards that the school offers that are beyond the state or the federal government. I'll use Wesleyan as a plug here. We have a grant that we award to students if their SAI falls within a certain range, okay? Just for falling within this range, they'll get $1,000 or $2,000. That's a very common practice. That's not unique to Wesleyan. But again, it would be my encouragement to don't leave that on the table because you chose not to file. File it, and I still think it's worth your time. Even if it's $1,000, I think it's worth your time. Okay? So there's reasons why I would encourage all families to file. And I know that the state of Illinois has a filing requirement for graduation purposes. So just be aware of that as well. So now we're going to get into some of the loan information. Again, want to make sure that this isn't an overly scary part of the presentation. but more that you've gathered information or know how to best utilize that if that's a route you choose to go, okay? So again, I mentioned earlier that federal loans are something that colleges are required to offer to students. They're not credit-based. The application for federal student loans is the FAFSA application. So they're considered an entitlement, so students are entitled to those funds if they continue the process and pursue them, okay? Now, they are obviously going to be seen as the lowest interest rate possible, and part of that is because they offer a fixed rate on the loan interest rates, okay? So if you look at what the interest rate is on a federal loan versus, say, a private loan, you could get a private loan at a lower interest rate, but it won't be fixed. And so that's why, I mean, when it says it's seen as the lowest cost or lowest interest rate, it's the lowest cost from a fixed interest rate perspective. Right now, the interest rate is 6.39%. It is tied to the Treasury bill rate, so it does change from year to year. But because the way that federal loans work is that it's a fixed rate for that year. So here's an example. Let's say this year your student took a $1,000 loan. That loan will always be 6.39% for the life of the loan until it's fully repaid. But if your student needs a loan in year 2, the year 2 loan can have a different interest rate than year 1 loan. But just know your year 1 loan will always be that 6.39%, or whatever it ends up being, okay? The Treasury bill rates change every May, so that's when the interest rates change for federal student loans, okay? So this year, this academic year, for the entire academic year, it's 6.39%. Starting next fall, it'll have a different interest rate because of the way that Treasury bill rates work. Federal student loans do not require any sort of repayment while the student's in school, and they have 6 months after graduation to actually start repayment. Okay, that 6 months is called a grace period. So if you've heard that term, that's what that is. They've got 6 months to get a job and on their feet and start that repayment process, but at 6 months is when they'll be required to make their first payment. There are 2 types of loans that we look at. There's a subsidized loan, which is need-based and students have to qualify for. And then there's unsubsidized loan that's not need-based, and everybody who files a FAFSA qualifies for, okay? The subsidized is that the interest is paid for by the government for that student while they're in school, whereas the unsubsidized, interest does accrue on that loan while your student's in school. Those are gonna be the main differences, okay? The other thing I want to draw your attention to is this thing down here called an origination fee. It's probably not the most talked about thing, but just know I told you so, okay? This is an important piece. Let's go to our $1,000 example, okay? So let's say you need a $1,000 loan, you're taking a $1,000 loan. The school does not receive $1,000. The school receives $990. That $10 is the processing fee or origination fee that the Department of Education keeps for making that $1,000 loan possible, okay? So that's how origination fees work. On all federal loans, there's an origination fee. Okay, so for the student loans, it's 1.057%, okay? But the loan is a $1,000 loan, that's the principal, plus any applicable interest if there is, okay? So just be aware of that. It's not the most touted thing out there, but that is a reality that we are living in, is that there is a processing fee assessed by the Department of Education and not the school that your student is looking to attend. Here are the annual maximums, the standard annual maximums that a student can borrow. So freshman year, first year, the max a student can borrow, the standard amount is $5,500. That's the maximum. Of that $5,500, no more than $3,500 can be subsidized, which is that interest-free portion, okay? What is very typical that you'll see is $3,500 subsidized, $2,000 unsubsidized for a total of the $5,500. That's pretty common, okay? But again, the subsidized is need-based and students have to qualify for it based upon their FAFSA application. So it is possible that your student may not qualify for all $3,500, but it is pretty common. So first year is $5,500, second year is $6,500, and then you'll notice junior and senior year are both $7,500 each. So they can't borrow up to whatever the remaining cost is from a federal loan program, okay? They are hard capped at these amounts, and they're set by the Department of Education and not by the school, okay? There are other options. There are parent loans available through the Department of Education if the parents want a parent loan. That is probably one of the more common ways to cover our remaining balance if additional financing is needed. is the parents are taking a federal Parent Plus loan. I mentioned anytime there's a federal loan, there's an origination fee, okay? So I'm going to draw your attention to that as well. The origination fee is 4.228%, okay? The students was 1.057%. So what does that mean? Well, let's use our $1,000 example. If you take a $1,000 plus loan, the school is only going to receive $958. That $42 difference is the fee that the Department of Education assesses for making that $1,000 possible, okay? What we typically say is, we typically would encourage you to include the fee in the total. So if you have a $1,000 balance and you need to have that paid off by the plus loan, then the loan would be for $1,042. So that when the government processes it, they'll send the money to the school for $1,000 and cover that balance. That's pretty common, okay? The plus loan doesn't have a hard cap or a hard maximum like the student loans do, okay? The cap would be up to the cost of the year if that's what the parent wants to do. So just be aware of that. There are private education loans out there. They're sometimes referred to as alternative loans. Those are going to be through like banks or credit unions or some other lending institution. That's typically where you see most of the stickiness when you hear stories about how a student is really gone over the top with the amount that they've borrowed. You'll hear the stories of my student borrowed $100,000 here or whatever it is. That's usually because they're also borrowing private education loans that can have significantly higher interest rates. I mentioned that the interest rate for the student loans at 6.39%. The parent loan has an 8.94%, which is also fixed. The private loans will allow you to choose between a variable rate or a fixed rate. Just know the fixed rate will always be higher because you're paying for some security there. I always say, in terms of how you choose one or the other, it's sort of what you think the economy is going to do over the next 14 years. And I say 14 years because it's 4 years in college and then 10 years in repayment. So 10 years is the standard repayment length for any sort of education loan system. And that oftentimes will help you sort of decide, do I choose a variable rate or a fixed rate? Often schools will offer payment plans or installment plans as well. So if you'd rather go that route, those are sort of the lowest cost option because there's generally no interest tied to payment plans. They tend to be kind of steep because usually what they are is they'll take your balance for that semester and divide it by 4 or 5 payments. So they can be kind of steep depending on your overall balance due. But just know there's no interest, although there might be a setup fee or an installment plan fee because oftentimes it's outsourced to a third party. Does anybody have a 529 account or a prepaid or a College Illinois account? Okay, so prepaid accounts are sort of unique. And ultimately what I would say is there's 2 ways to handle a prepaid account. There's either a lump sum method or a per credit hour method, okay? There is a transfer form that you'll get from that 529 or the prepaid account. On that transfer form, you'll designate how you want to use the money. The lump sum method is you can take any amount you want up to the value of the account, okay, at that time. But once it's gone, it's gone. What we typically recommend at the school level is do the per credit hour, and you get a fixed amount of money each semester based upon the number of classes your students enrolled for, and then it sort of kind of functions like an extra grant or an extra scholarship to help reduce that balance due, and is a little more reliable every semester that your students enrolled. Now, depending on what kind of plan you purchased, if it was like a 2-year plan or a community college and then a 4-year plan, or if it was a straight 4-year plan, those matter because they have different payout rates. So you'll want to make sure you speak with your 529 reps and find out what the payout rates, if you are going to use that per credit hour method. It will depend on what kind of school your student goes to and then what those payout rates are and what kind of plan you purchased, okay? So a lot of variables there to manage, but just know there's a transfer form and then you get to designate how you want those funds used. So now we're going to sort of go to a 30,000 foot level of how do we compare colleges in cost, okay? I just sort of picked 3 cost points that I think are pretty typical nowadays. no one in particular, but we have cost of A, B, and C colleges, okay? And these are round numbers to try and sort of get around the idea of what you should be thinking about and what you should be looking for when trying to compare the cost of colleges, okay? So as you can see, colleges are all gonna cost differently. No one's gonna be the exact same cost as someone else, okay? The SAI is gonna be the same no matter where your student goes to, because it's not based on the school, it's based on the family-specific situation, okay? And then we have a remaining cost here. This kind of goes back to that financial need formula, okay? The financial need is going to be a little bit dependent upon what the cost of the college is. Remember that cost of attendance number we talked about? That's sort of an inflated number. This is sort of how that plays out from a financial aid perspective, okay? So the cost of the college is going to impact the amount of need or the remaining costs that we have to work with. And then what financial aid packages should look like, or what you should look for, is sort of the grant amount that is used to fill that need. Everyone's going to have the same loan amount. Generally, everyone's going to have the same student employment or job amount in terms of, depending on qualifications. But what's sort of important is going to be this grant number here, okay? As you can see, as costs rise, the amount of grants should rise. It should coincide with that, okay? If you're starting to look at financial aid award letters and you sort of see a disparity there, that might either cause you to ask some questions or maybe rule out certain schools, okay? One thing I always talk about here is every school is required to have a net price calculator on their website. A net price calculator is sort of a way for schools to estimate cost for you. It usually gets you into a specific range, like your costs could be from $6,000 to $10,000 depending on the information in that calculator. But if you want as early read as possible of what financial aid would look like and what costs would look like, look at the net price calculator. Every college is required to have one. The important piece of that is going to be net cost. That's essentially what I want to draw your attention to, is net cost. Net cost is your tuition and fees minus any grants and scholarships. Okay? Part of the net price calculator should tell you what is the net price or the net cost. Okay? Same thing, slightly different terminology. That is going to be sort of that is going to be your true cost, all right? And then they'll have a final cost at the bottom, and that will be with loans and student employment and other resources like that. But your net price is going to be your tuition, fees, housing, and food minus any grants and scholarships. That's the free aid, okay? So that will be more of the telling piece. But ultimately what you're looking for is as the cost of the college goes up, the aid should sort of coincide with that as well. Okay? Maybe not dollar for dollar, but that's kind of what you're looking for, and sort of thinking about, are there any outliers that don't follow that thought process? Because if so, either they're missing information or that may no longer be a financial option for your family. Okay? So some general notes that I thought would be helpful for you all to be aware of is, again, I say that students can accept or decline any form of financial aid that the student has as part of their financial aid package. So when they get something in the mail, or if they're directed to go online to a student portal, there'll be a variety of things. It should be itemized in terms of what your students qualify for. Just know that your student can decline any form of aid, including grants. Okay, there may be reasons why your student would decline a grant. Maybe the renewal requirements are lofty, or there are some grants out there like the federal Teach Grant that if certain conditions are not met, can turn into a loan later. Okay, so when you're looking at a financial aid award package, there should be a notes section, sort of the fine print or the small print. Make sure you take the time to read those, because it will often disclose what the renewal requirements and if there are any caveats like the Teach Grant might have. So it's important for you to read. I just talked about renewal requirements. There are scholarship schemes out there, so be careful. Those are generally going to be like private scholarships. If you get to a place where you're doing a scholarship search online and you get to a place that says enter your credit card information, you're probably in the wrong place. Okay, I'm going to give you a website that I think is helpful towards the end of this presentation about for private scholarships. There are services out there that will say, pay us $200 and we'll find scholarships for you. That is an option. I don't typically recommend them. I tend to be more of I like a little elbow grease. I like a little effort into it. And I think your student can do it for free. I tend to be a little bit more economically frugal, we'll say. And I think it's a good way for students to learn discipline by making them go after scholarships. So that's what I would encourage you to do, but should you go to one of those routes, just be careful about putting in your credit card information online. Juniors, if you have a junior, there's really nothing you can do with FAFSA or the financial aid process right now. There are online estimators. There is a FAFSA estimator. There are the net price calculators on university and college websites that you can use to try and get as much early information as possible. But if you have a junior, sit tight because you got one more year before you need to start jumping through some of this. And then when you file the FAFSA, every school is required to report certain performance data points. Okay? One of those things is graduation rate. We say consider schools with those different markers. There's a report called IPEDS, which is a federal report, and when you submit the FAFSA, at the end of that report, it will tell you some of that IPEDS data about each school that was listed on the FAFSA. It will tell you, hey, this is this school's graduation rate at 4 years, which is the percentage of students that graduate within 4 years. And here's their graduation rate after 6 years. The higher that number obviously means increases the graduation rate, the better performance that school is, or the better that school prepares your student for entering the workforce. So there are things like that that I think are helpful. One thing I always talk about here is also there's a website called the College Scorecard, which is also a federal website where you can compare things like what is the mean or median income of a student earns from certain schools 10 years out. So if you want to know what's the average income that someone will earn after 10 years of graduating from a certain school, it will display that kind of information. And you can compare those colleges side by side. It will tell you things like what is their cohort default rate for those students who take loans, how many of those default on average as opposed to another school. And so just be aware that there are some things like that can sort of help guide you through making a college selection in terms of where's the best value for your student. Here's some tips. I know this one's really sort of a boring one, and I often do it myself, but read the instructions, don't skip them, okay? I remember on FAFSA, every question is gonna have that little circle with the question mark in it that's sort of your hints and your tips. Don't be scared to click on that little circle, okay? Read it very carefully. Know what state and institutional deadlines there are. Remember I mentioned the state doesn't set their deadline until like 2 days until they're ready to set it, and we won't know what that is, okay? Colleges will have their own preferential filing dates. I put Wesleyan's up here as November 1st just as a way to kind of contextualize it for you. There may be differences between financial aid filing dates and admissions application dates, okay? So just sort of know what those dates are and how to best manage them. And if you send anything in via mail, it's not overly common nowadays, but if you do, please make a copy just so you can reference that and send it in if it gets lost in the mail. Oftentimes you'll be directed to upload information to a student portal or online portal these days. That's pretty common. But if you do send anything snail mail, it does get lost, okay? So just make copies before you send it. Here are some websites that I think are helpful for you. The first one I put on there is College Board. There are some schools that will require an institutional financial aid application in addition to the FAFSA. They'll use the FAFSA for federal and state eligibility, and then they'll use their institutional application for their institutional aid, okay? A lot of schools will use the CSS profile, which is done through the College Board. So that's why they put the College Board up there. It's not a free application, it's about $35 to file, but you can file one application and it can go to many different schools for one submission. So you don't have to keep paying for every school that you want to send that to, and not all schools accept the CSS profile, but many who require an institutional application will accept the CSS profile, and that's done through College Board. Fastweb.com is that scholarship website that I recommend. I have sort of a love-hate relationship with it, honestly. I love it because I literally talk to students every year that get scholarships from fastweb.com. The hate part is not really much of a hate. It's just the #1 place for scholarships. So it's safe, it's reliable, but the competition is real, okay? Squeaky wheel tends to get the grease. So if your student's not aggressive with following up on applications they submit, it's an online world. And so it's very easy to not put a face with a name. So I encourage your student to be aggressive. I try and monetize it for families and say, hey student, this is a $2,000 scholarship and it takes you 20 hours to get it. That's $100 an hour. I still think it's worth your time. So monetize it for them. Put it in real world sense. I would love to make $100 an hour. That's a great way to contextualize it, to make it financially viable. So if mom and dad, if you're having problems motivating them, make it real for them, okay? Studentaid.gov is the FAFSA website. That's going to be all things FAFSA. If you want to know anything you could ever want to know about the federal aid system or federal loans, or you're having trouble sleeping at night, boom, studentaid.gov, you're welcome, okay? I put Wesleyan's website on there because sometimes it's easier to read information that's a little bit more reader-friendly. The FAFSA website is more like text dump, like paragraph after paragraph. That's just why I usually, like, if you're having trouble sleeping, go to the FAFSA website. It's a lot of text. Sometimes if you can go to a college's website and it's a little more user-friendly because it's like, what do you need to know? Bing, bang, boom, you're done. And then I put finaid.org on there as well, which is a free public website that you can go and get any information that you want about any sort of financial aid. They have loan calculators on there, so if you're bored one Saturday morning and you want to say, hey, how much money would I pay back if I took a $10,000 loan at 5%? You could calculate that on the website. Like this, it's a free tool. You don't have to sign up for anything. But finaid.org is a great resource for anything and everything financial aid. Here's my contact information. Feel free to write down. I would love to have conversations with you if you have questions. Even if it's not Wesleyan specifically, I get calls from parents and families or emails all the time that say, hey, my student's looking at JJC, or they're going to ISU, or they're going to X college, whatever that looks like. I'm happy to answer questions and be a guiding light for you. Again, even if I can't answer the question, then I'll say, hey, you need to go check out the financial aid office at that other institution to get more specific information. But if you want someone to bounce an idea off of, happy to be that resource for you. We do this as a community service, so it's not a Wesleyan pitch. I'm passionate about financial aid. I'm kind of a nerd like that. So honestly, bug me. So it is question time. So I'm here to answer any questions. So you go ahead and raise your hand and let me know what I can do to help you. If it's personal or really specific, maybe jot it down and come up to me here after we're all done tonight publicly, and I can walk you through that question as best as I can. But with that, any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Does each state have their own, like, if you're planning on going out of state, does each state have their own different, like the math grants?
Okay, good question. So does each state have their own state grant system? Generally, the answer is going to be yes, but you would need to have established residency in that state to become eligible for that state's aid. So if your student's an Illinois student, they decide to go to Indiana, your student would have to establish residency in Indiana in order for them to potentially qualify for Indiana grant systems. Does that make sense? Most states would require at least a 12-month residency, and some states will require a 12-month residency before attending college, depending on the state. So it just depends on the state rules. I think Missouri is a little lighter. I think that's like 6 months. I could be wrong. They could have changed that recently, now that I think of it, but oftentimes it's 12 months residency in order to establish residency. Good question. More questions?
Okay,
Go for it.
Department of Ed changes. All this stuff that's been in the news and stuff, and then the change in loans and all this, blah, blah, blah. How is this going to affect our FAFSA for next year?
Great question. So changes to the Department of Education and federal funding and other things that's going on politically with higher education. So as of right now, there has been talks, and it looks like they are potentially going to dissolve the Department of Education. But the good news is, from a financial aid perspective, is federal student aid is a separate entity under the umbrella of the Department of Education, and federal student aid has largely, I come to think of it, yeah, largely been unaffected by any of the stuff that's going on in Washington. So right now, they've approved for flat funding for Pell, which means that they aren't reducing the Pell grant. They're not changing the way that they're doing any of the grant systems in the government or the loan systems. So largely federal student aid is the agency that dictates and governs and oversees all of the financial aid stuff for colleges, all of the higher education stuff, as opposed to the larger umbrella of the Department of Education, which oversees all of federal education programs. That's the one that's sort of up in turmoil right now. So it is a branch underneath the Department of Education, but largely what I foresee happening is that federal student aid will be reorged or moved over to a different wing, if you will. They'll be just sort of consolidated to another branch within the government for oversight. But right now, I'm not hearing anything about reductions in funding or programs or any of that kind of stuff. Is it possible? Sure. Anything is possible. But so far as in right now, what they're releasing to the financial aid community, nothing has been impacted from a financial aid perspective. Yes?
I actually have two questions. One, if my child is thinking about going to a trade school, is it still beneficial to fill the FAFSA? Is there still money involved in trade schools?
My question is yes, depending on the trade school. Not all trade schools will qualify to receive federal aid. They should be able to tell you that ahead of time. You should be able to find that on their website, and if for some reason you can't find their website, just fire off an email to someone and they can tell you whether or not they're federal aid eligible. Some are and some are not. Largely, if we're talking about trades, I still think it's worth your time, even from a federal or state requirements. It's not common that you'll get anything from the trade school, but I wouldn't want you to miss out on any, or your student to miss out on any federal or state opportunities, because it may be a possibility. It just depends on the school.
And then also, if we had a FAFSA ID, do we have to remember that, or are we getting a whole new one as a parent?
Good question. So if you already have an FSA ID, you're going to use the same one you've always used. If you don't know what it is, there is a forgot user ID and password through the studentaid.gov website. Again, the trick to that is you just have to remember what email address you registered that FSA ID with, because it's very particular about that. Remember, that email address is sort of a stickler. That's why parents and students can't register their FSIDs with the same email account. There has to be two separate email accounts, but you do need access to that email account, or it's going to be a royal pain to get that FSA ID reset for you. Any more questions? These are all good questions. None? That good? All right, great. I'll be up here if you got questions. Let me say this one more time. Thank you so much for spending some time with me tonight. I know it's not the most fun, but honestly, you're doing yourselves a world of favor later on. Okay? So thank you so much. Drive safe and have a good night.